In every journey of growth, there's a moment before the moment. A moment when everything is still, when the world is quiet, and all you have is a spark inside you, waiting to awaken. It's a spark you may not always see, a spark others may overlook, but it never disappears. It grows in silence, gathers strength in the shadows, and prepares you for something greater. And then, the first crack appears. A crack in old habits, a crack in old beliefs, a crack in the story you were told about your limits. That crack widens, your perspective shifts, your vision sharpens, and suddenly, there's no going back. Because once you see your potential, you cannot deny it. The spark becomes a surge, the surge becomes a wave, and the wave becomes a burst of pure possibility, breaking through every layer of doubt, every barrier, every shadow that once held you down. In that burst, something new emerges, a new identity, a new posture, a new sense of purpose. You stand taller, clearer, stronger. And from that moment on, you don't walk into the future the same way. You step forward with confidence, with intention, with the power to transform not just your work, but your life. This is your awakening. This is where your transformation begins. Every enterprise reaches a moment where the old way of working can no longer carry the weight of its ambitions. For Helios, that moment came quietly, beneath the dashboards, inside the daily friction no one could fully explain. What looked like a strategy problem became a capability problem. What appeared to be a talent issue became a culture issue. And what leaders blamed on resistance was really system overload, fragmentation, and drift spreading across an entire organization. In this episode, we step inside Helios, not as critics, but as architects. We explore the Helios Transformation Model, a full enterprise diagnostic blueprint built through the tri-model engine and powered by performance intelligence. You'll learn how to diagnose failure across thousands of people, how to detect drift before it becomes decline, and how to realign an entire enterprise with precision, clarity, and speed. This is not a case study. This is a model, a framework for leaders who must transform not just a team, not just a function, but an entire system. Welcome to Episode 9. Welcome to Enterprise-Level Transformation. Enterprise transformations don't fail because leaders are incompetent. They fail because large organizations hide their truth behind data, dashboards, and overly simplified narratives. At Helios, the real crisis wasn't the missed revenue targets, it wasn't the customer churn spikes, and it wasn't the fractured collaboration between divisions. The real crisis was that every signal of system breakdown appeared months before collapse, but no one had the tools or the visibility to understand what those signals meant. In a company of this size, a single delay can echo across 10 departments. A skills gap in one function becomes a capability failure in another. Culture shifts in one division quietly shape the behavior of thousands. And by the time traditional metrics detect the problem, the damage is already systemic. This episode matters because it reveals the truth leaders rarely see, that enterprise failure is never one problem. It is always a chain reaction. We use the Helios Transformation Model to show you what that chain reaction looks like, how to read it, how to diagnose it, and how to realign an entire organization before the damage becomes irreversible. This is the lens leaders must bring into the boardroom, because at the enterprise level, transformation isn't about fixing issues. It's about understanding the system that produces them. To understand enterprise-level change, we need an enterprise model worthy of the challenge. Helios Corporation is a 14,200 employee global organization operating across cloud services, enterprise software, medical devices, and logistics. 9 business units, 43 countries, 4 different regulatory environments, and more than a dozen distinct subcultures operating under a single corporate identity. On paper, Helios is strong, high-performing pockets, brilliant product teams, a logistics operation admired across the industry. But under the surface, like most large organizations, no single system governs how execution, capability, and culture behave at scale. Each department has its own rhythm, its own norms, its own interpretation of how we operate. This works until pressure hits. Helios becomes the perfect environment to demonstrate the integrated change engine. It is big enough to show complexity, diverse enough to expose misalignment, and structured enough to reveal with absolute clarity where leaders misdiagnose the truth. This episode isn't just about Helios, it's about every organization operating across multiple teams, divisions, and geographies, where success is never determined by one unit, but by the system that binds them together. To understand the transformation of an entire enterprise, we need to begin with one simple truth. Helios wasn't failing in one place. It was failing everywhere at once, quietly, structurally, and predictably. From the outside, Helios still looked stable. Products were shipping, clients were renewing, teams were working. But beneath the metrics, the organization had entered a slow-motion breakdown across execution, capability, and culture. Execution had become unstable. Cross-functional projects were slipping without warning. Handoffs between operations, product, and customer experience stalled. Backlogs reshaped overnight. Leaders assumed it was fatigue or lack of discipline, but the reality was deeper. Capabilities were misaligned. Some teams were drowning in work, others were underutilized. Critical skills were missing in product ops, while CX was carrying hidden rework that no one upstream saw. Performance had become inconsistent, not because of talent, but because the system was unbalanced. And beneath it all, culture was quietly fracturing. Trust was thinning, escalation slowed, leaders stopped raising concerns. Alignment across the mid-level leadership tier broke down, creating 3 different versions of the truth inside one company. This is why enterprise failure is so dangerous. It doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes. One delay, one assumption, one misalignment at a time. And unless leaders know how to diagnose these signals at scale, the organization can cross a threshold that becomes incredibly difficult to reverse. This is the enterprise problem Helios faced, and this is the moment where the tri-model engine becomes not a tool, but a lifeline. On the surface, Helios looked like a company dealing with familiar problems. Numbers were slipping, rework was rising, cross-team tensions were growing. Every executive recognized the symptoms, because they looked like the same issues that appear in every organization under pressure. But these were just the surface indicators. The dashboards showed noise, but not the underlying story. Each department was presenting a different narrative. Operations blamed product blamed strategy blamed bandwidth. Everyone was pointing at the symptoms, and no one was asking what was driving them. Leadership saw missed deadlines, but not why work was slowing. They saw rework, but not where capability gaps were forming. They saw friction between groups, but not the systemic misalignment that created the friction. And because they only saw the surface, they made surface-level decisions. More meetings, tighter deadlines, tougher reviews, new reporting formats, none of which touched the real failure pattern. This is the moment in every enterprise when leaders believe they understand the problem, but in reality, they're staring at shadows, not causes. When Helios first examined the data, leaders believed they were dealing with isolated performance issues. Production delays here, a capacity pinch there, a communication challenge between 2 departments. But the surface signals were misleading. They weren't seeing the real system at work, only the shadows it cast. Once the tri-model engine and performance intelligence were applied, everything changed. The organization began seeing what traditional dashboards never show: systemic drift. Not because people were failing, but because execution, capability, and culture were pulling in different directions. The first breakthrough came from recognizing early behavioral signals instead of waiting for quarterly metrics. Micro delays, quiet hesitation, unexpected rework patterns, cross-team frictions that showed up long before any KPI turned red. These signals revealed the truth. The system wasn't misaligned in one place, it was misaligned everywhere. Suddenly, for the first time, Helios had a unified enterprise view, not a collection of department dashboards, but a single integrated picture that connected execution flow, capability load, cultural behaviors, and early warning indicators into one operating model. And with that clarity, root causes didn't take a quarter, they took days. That shift triggered the second breakthrough, leadership behavior. Decisions moved from reactive to predictive. Priorities stopped colliding. Bottlenecks surfaced immediately instead of quietly compounding. Departments realigned their work to match true capacity instead of assumptions or habit. And perhaps most importantly, culture and execution finally locked back together. Teams weren't just working harder, they were working in rhythm. Momentum wasn't accidental, it was engineered, and the enterprise felt the lift almost instantly. This is the power of PI combined with the tri-model engine. It transforms a complex, drifting organization into a coherent system where insight is fast, decisions are aligned, and execution accelerates across the entire enterprise. When the tri-model is applied at the enterprise level, something remarkable happens inside an organization like Helios. The noise of departments, the complexity of functions, the constant collisions of priorities begin to resolve into a single, coherent picture. With system-wide visibility, leaders stop guessing. They can finally see how execution, capability, and culture interact across dozens of teams, not as separate streams, but as a connected operating system. Cross-team alignment becomes measurable. No more mismatched timelines, no more unbalanced workloads, no more surprises buried in downstream functions. Every team is moving in rhythm, not in isolation. Because the tri-model exposes early warning signals at scale, leaders no longer react to quarterly reports or downstream complaints. They intervene before drift becomes damage, before culture strains, before capability cracks, before execution stalls. And as the diagnostics unify, real-time adjustment becomes possible. Priorities recalibrate quickly, workload balance stabilizes, departments synchronize around the same operating cadence. This is what enterprise transformation looks like when the system itself becomes intelligent. Capability strengthens, culture stabilizes, execution accelerates, and the entire organization regains momentum. The tri-model doesn't just fix isolated teams, it turns the whole enterprise into a predictable, aligned, high-performance engine. Up to this point, Helios executives believed they were dealing with isolated problems, missed deadlines here, turnover there, a handful of quality issues, and a general sense of organizational fatigue. But when the tri-model engine was applied at enterprise scale, everything changed. This is the first reveal of the Helios Enterprise Diagnostic Map, a living X-ray of pressure, alignment, and drift across the organization. What you're seeing here are not just data points. These are connection lines, behavioral pathways, capturing how work, communication, and friction actually move through the enterprise. First, the map exposed execution strain zones, small pockets where teams were compensating, firefighting, and quietly absorbing hidden workload that no dashboard ever showed. Next, it revealed capability bottlenecks, roles that were overextended, undersupported, or misaligned with actual work demand. These bottlenecks cascaded across functions, slowing work downstream. Then came the cultural layer. The diagnostic map made visible the cultural friction points, places where trust had eroded, where escalation slowed, and where teams hesitated to surface issues. Most organizations never see this. But with PI, the map showed cross-team drift lines, the behavioral cracks between departments where handoffs broke down, communication patterns diverged, and collaboration began to stall. As drift widened, we saw workload imbalance clusters appear, small groups carrying disproportionate responsibility while others unknowingly fell out of sync. And finally, the system highlighted signal hotspots, early warning locations where the first signs of strain, hesitation, or friction emerged. These hotspots are where enterprise collapse begins, and where enterprise transformation begins as well. The diagnostic map didn't just show Helios what was happening, it showed them why it was happening, and exactly where to intervene before the entire system fractured. Cross-functional alignment is where most enterprise transformations silently fail. And at Helios, this is where the deepest problems emerged. On paper, every department said the same thing. We're aligned, we're committed, we're on track. But the diagnostic map told a very different story. The first issue was misaligned priorities. Marketing was driving aggressive customer commitments. Operations was working from last quarter's capacity assumptions. Engineering was firefighting technical debt. No one was wrong, but no one was working from the same picture of reality. Then we uncovered conflicting timelines. Departments were hitting their internal milestones, but those milestones didn't connect to each other. One team finished early, another finished late, and work piled up in the gaps between them. Handoffs became the breaking point. What one team considered done was nowhere near what the receiving team actually needed. This created broken handoffs, which cascaded into rework, frustration, and a quiet erosion of trust. Behind the scenes, competing incentives pulled teams in opposite directions. Some groups were rewarded for speed, others were rewarded for accuracy. Still others were rewarded for minimizing risk. They weren't misbehaving, they were simply behaving according to the system. Communication hardened into silos. Teams talked a lot, but rarely with the teams who actually needed the information. This created dependency blind spots, places where no one realized their work was blocking an entire downstream chain. The result? A fully capable enterprise operating as if it were 5 separate organizations. Team Orion wasn't failing alone. It was failing inside a system where the alignment tissue had broken down. And the only way to rebuild that tissue was through the tri-model engine, bringing execution, capability, culture, and PI into a single shared operating picture. When Helios shifted from team-level repair to enterprise-level transformation, culture became the decisive battleground. Not culture as mood, not culture as slogans, but culture as the operating environment people perform inside. The truth is this: execution will never stabilize if the behavioral environment around it is unstable. At scale, culture isn't about inspiration, it's about consistency. It's the invisible system of norms, expectations, communication patterns, and psychological signals that tell people what is safe, what is valued, and what the organization truly rewards. Before the shift, Helios had 9 different subcultures competing inside one company. Every department had its own version of how we do things, which meant alignment slowed the moment cross-functional work began. The intervention changed that. Leaders were retrained to model the new norms: clarity in communication, steadiness under pressure, predictable check-ins, and trust-first escalation. These behavioral signals started cascading downward. Managers began using the same language, the same processes, the same expectations. Teams no longer wondered how another department operated. The system unified them. The biggest shift came from psychological safety. When people felt safe raising issues early, execution stabilized. When they felt trust from leadership, hesitation disappeared. When communication rhythms were predictable, cross-functional work accelerated. Culture became a performance engine, not a background factor. This is the part most executives miss. Culture doesn't scale through speeches. Culture scales through systems, through rhythm, through behavioral modeling. And when you engineer it correctly, the culture becomes self-reinforcing, aligning execution, capability, and PI in ways no dashboard can measure alone. When Helios finally pivoted from siloed problem solving to performance intelligence, everything changed. For the first time, executives saw the enterprise as a single living system, not 12 departments moving in 12 different directions. They saw where execution was failing, where capability was mismatched, and where culture was quietly constricting performance. The turnaround plan wasn't complicated, it was structured. First, leaders unified the enterprise picture: one map, one operating truth, one shared definition of what mattered most. From that point forward, priorities weren't debated, they were sequenced. Second, cross-functional resets aligned departments that had drifted apart. Teams who had been unknowingly working against each other were realigned to a single rhythm. Bottlenecks surfaced quickly. Dependencies became predictable again. Third, capabilities were realigned to the real workload, not the imagined one. Skill gaps were closed, handoffs became crisp, and the workload was redistributed to eliminate quiet burnout. Fourth, culture was integrated into the execution system. Helios didn't rely on motivation. They relied on behavioral consistency, the kind of cultural operating rhythm that removes fear, hesitation, and ambiguity. And finally, the performance intelligence loop was embedded into daily, weekly, and monthly operations. Drift was detected early, friction was diagnosed accurately, realignment happened fast, before damage accumulated. The result? Stabilization in weeks, not quarters. Cross-team friction evaporated, execution flow returned, decisions became predictive instead of reactive, and the enterprise regained something it had been missing for years: forward momentum. This is what PI-driven realignment does. It doesn't just fix problems, it restores the entire enterprise operating system. When the dust settled at Helios, the story wasn't simply that the crisis ended. It was that the organization began operating at a fundamentally different level. Within the first 90 days, execution stabilized across the enterprise. On-time delivery increased by 38%, not because people worked harder, but because the system finally stopped fighting itself. Cross-functional cycle time dropped by 27%, fewer delays, fewer handoffs hanging in limbo, fewer work streams collapsing under hidden dependencies. The organization began to move as one unit, not 11 disconnected teams. Rework, one of the most silent killers, fell by 41%. Why? Because clarity increased, priorities became unambiguous, and the noise that once forced teams to fix things twice was eliminated at the root. But numbers only tell half the story. Culturally, Helios felt different. People stopped operating out of fear and started operating out of alignment. Psychological safety returned, the kind where people can tell the truth early enough to prevent damage. Decision-making accelerated. Leaders no longer reacted to emergencies. They anticipated them through early PI signals. The organization began to predict friction before it ever reached a customer. And perhaps most importantly, momentum became sustainable. This wasn't a heroic push. It wasn't a temporary rally. It was a structural realignment, a system that now corrects itself instead of constantly needing rescue. In the end, the real result wasn't improved metrics. It was an enterprise built to stay aligned no matter the pressure, the pace, or the complexity. Here's the lesson that every executive at Helios had to confront, and it's the same lesson every leader faces when an organization begins to drift. Failure never begins with a catastrophic event. It starts quietly, almost politely, as invisible pressure distributed unevenly across the system. Drift is never personal. It is never one team, one manager, or one performance issue. Drift is systemic. It is the interaction of execution, capability, culture, and load, all moving out of alignment at the same time. Executives learn that behavior tells the truth long before metrics do. Micro delays, hesitation patterns, silent rework. Across the enterprise, these were early warning signals, not noise. They learn that you cannot inspect your way to alignment. More meetings, more dashboards, more pressure. None of it repairs a system that's misaligned underneath. Real alignment comes from the system itself resetting, not from intensity, not from fear, and not from urgency. And finally, Helios learned this. Performance intelligence is not reporting, it is visibility. And visibility is what allows an enterprise to correct drift before it becomes collapse. This was the leadership transformation, the shift from managing people to managing the system that people depend on. Every enterprise transformation collapses under one problem: too much information and not enough clarity. This tool solves that. The executive summary template distills the entire Helios diagnostic: execution strain, capability gaps, cultural drag, and cross-functional drift into a single, trusted system snapshot. Not a story, not an opinion, a clean, objective readout of how the organization is actually operating. Section 1 gives leaders the situation snapshot, the truth of the system as it stands today. Section 2 highlights the pressure points, the exact areas where execution, capability, and culture are under strain. Section 3 exposes the drift lines, the cross-functional breakdowns that no dashboard ever reveals, but every leader must understand. Section 4 moves directly into interventions, the smallest set of actions that will unlock the largest system movement. And Section 5 presents projected outcomes, the measurable impact leaders should expect when alignment is restored. This is the first time executives see the whole enterprise on one page, not as disconnected departments, but as one living system. And from this point on, every leadership decision moves from assumption to intelligence. You've just completed one of the most complex parts of this entire journey, learning how to diagnose and realign an entire enterprise under pressure in real time. Most leaders never get this far. Most organizations never learn how to see the system beneath the symptoms, but you just did. You now understand what thousands of executives miss, that execution, capability, culture, and load are never independent forces. They are one system, one engine, one truth. And because you understand that system, you're capable of something extraordinary, transforming not just a team, not just a department, but an entire organization. That is the level you've reached. And make no mistake, this is an accomplishment most leaders will never experience. In these last 9 episodes, you've built what many consider impossible. You learned how to lead change instead of announce it. You learned how to diagnose execution with surgical clarity. You learned how to build capability instead of burn people out. You learned how culture actually works, not as slogans, but as behavior. And you learned how to see drift before it becomes collapse. You now have a model, a real model, that can turn chaos into alignment, pressure into clarity, and friction into momentum. And if you've made it this far, you are not the same leader you were when you started. But we're not done yet. In fact, the most important part is still ahead, because a transformation is only as strong as the tools that sustain it. Next episode, episode 10, is the finale, the Change Leaders Toolkit. This is where everything comes together: the diagnostics, the rhythm, the PI system, the cultural signals, the entire engine. I'm going to give you every tool, every worksheet, every diagnostic, every map you need to apply this model inside your organization, immediately and consistently. If episodes 1 to 9 built the engine, episode 10 puts the keys in your hand. You've earned this moment. You've built the foundation. Now let's finish the mission.